A guy wisely said to me, you don't get an education in college. You lay a foundation for an education. Pick an author who will take you places and make him your life study. So anyway, I picked Lewis. He was my liberal arts education. I read Lewis, he took me to Homer. I read Lewis, he took me to Virgil. I read Lewis, he took me to Plato and Aristotle. Took me to Boethius. My word, I'd never heard of Boethius till I encountered him in C.S. Lewis. You can appeal to the mind and it may just stay there. You want to appeal to the emotion and the heart, you've got to depict it. He thought Christianity could bring this in a holistic way together. And that's what Lewis is trying to do. That's why he writes propositionally and depicts imaginatively.
In this episode of the Wayfaring Stranger podcast, I talked to Dr. Jerry Root, Professor Emeritus of Evangelism at Wheaton College and a renowned C.S. Lewis scholar. Dr. Root is known for his extensive research on C.S. Lewis, his numerous books on the subject, and his lectures on Lewis at universities around the world. In this conversation, we discuss Dr. Root's journey from a young athlete to becoming a devoted Christian and scholar. We explore his perspective on the integration of faith and learning, his thoughts on the enduring influence of C.S. Lewis, and how he approaches reading and writing. May his story of intellectual curiosity inspire you to read deeply, broaden your understanding, and find joy in lifelong learning on your spiritual journey. I hope you enjoy this episode.
Do you know where broadcast comes from, the term?
No, I don't.
So there was a guy named Reed, and he was the guy that founded the BBC. And he was kind of a crusty guy, but he was a Christian, but had some rough edges. And he was trying to figure out what he would call the transmissions that they would have. That morning he was having a quiet time in Matthew 13 in the King James Version. And it said, a sower went out to sow, and he sowed his seed broadcast. And he said, there's the word. And broadcast comes from Matthew 13.
Wow.
The source for that story is C.S. Lewis at the BBC. And there's a guy who was a historian of the BBC who wrote a book on how Lewis happened to do those broadcasts that became Mere Christianity. And he tells the story right in the first or second chapter.
Wow. So you grew up in, you said South Central Los Angeles?
Yeah. Do you know, if you know Los Angeles, and you do since you live there, do you know where Olvera Street is?
Yes, I do.
It's the original street. That's Central. Right next to it, there's a street that runs all the way to Santa Monica, and that's Alameda Street. If you went south on Alameda and you went down a few miles between Florence and Firestone, I lived 3 blocks off of Alameda between Florence and Firestone. That's where I grew up.
So what was your childhood like? Were you raised in the church?
I was raised in a church. We went every Sunday. We went every time the doors of the church were open, but I never heard the gospel there. I was told that if I went to a movie and Jesus came back while I was in the theater, I'd go straight to hell. If I had a drink or smoked or cussed or even had an inappropriate thought, I was told if I lived a holy and righteous life all my life, but had one bad thought the last second of my life, I'd go straight to hell. So as a boy, what I deduced from that is if I could lose this based on what I did, I had to gain it based on what I did. So I never heard the gospel there. I think they were good-hearted people at that church. I liked them, and they were friends of our families and so on. And we were at the church potlucks and picnics and stuff like that. Our whole family social life revolved around the church. But it was tyranny for me. I'd go to bed at night saying, forgive me, hoping that my last thought would be a prayer for forgiveness so that if I died during the night, I had the hope I'd go to heaven. But as soon as I woke up the next morning, if I slugged my brother or got in an argument with somebody, I'd lost it again. I never understood how the gospel worked in that equation till I was in college.
You came to Christ, it must have been close to 70? Or
No, 68.
68, okay.
Yeah, my first week of college.
Wow.
I went to college early. I played football. You have to take it by faith now, but I played football in college.
Yeah.
And I got there for 2-a-days, preseason practice. And it was actually, there was a Campus Crusade for Christ group on campus. and they were starting their college. They called it College Life. It was an evangelistic outreach.
Mm.
So I was invited to the Campus Crusade for Christ meeting by my brother and his roommate. And it was the first time I heard a clear presentation to the gospel. I didn't need to hear that I was a sinner. I knew that. I was convinced about that. I just didn't know God loved me and could forgive me. And I heard the message for the first time clearly presented, and I responded to it like a fish to water.
Mm.
And so I was so grateful. I still am. I've never stopped being grateful for what Jesus did for me.
What was their message? You kind of said a little bit. What were they telling you?
Well, it's interesting the way I try and help other people understand. This is what I learned from it, basically. I didn't come to Christ because of some great apologetic argument for God's existence or some solution to the problem of evil. I like that stuff. I've written a book on the problem of evil and so on. And those things are interesting to me. I came to Jesus because I was aware I was messed up. And I don't think anybody who's lived a moment of honest life is unaware if they're honest. I believe in the high ideal of love, but there have been times I've had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world. And I believe in justice, but there have been times I've been unfair. People who call out the injustice of others and are blind to their own injustices, it's sad to me. The incongruity is there. We're messed up. And consequently, I was aware, and I didn't know that I could be forgiven and loved. So it was not an apologetic argument that won me. It was the overwhelming message that's at the core. Apologetics is scaffolding on the gospel. And the scaffolding's good. I've taught courses in apologetics. I like that stuff. But it's the gospel. I think the gospel itself is the greatest apologetic. If people know that they could be loved and forgiven. So...
Yeah, I agree with you. I think also sometimes people aren't living honest life where they need to be told they need that. You know what I mean? So we can be caught up and distracted to the point where we don't see the bad news enough to where we know that we need good news.
Frederick Buechner is an author I really like. He said, before the gospel could be good news, it's got to be bad news.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis said, too, before people will respond to the gospel, they have to have awakened in them a sense of their own sin. He said, I don't think you begin by pointing theirs out, but being honest about your own struggles allows them to enter into the honesty and the discussion and go from there. And I can give you an example of that. I've spoken at probably 8 of the different Oxford University colleges. One night, I gave a evensong service at Hartford College. The guy who was a chaplain there at that time was a guy named Michael Chantry, and he was a friend. So I spoke at the evensong service, and he invited me to have high table. High table's pretty spectacular. If you saw the Harry Potter movies, remember when the owls are flying in? That's a hall at Oxford at Christ Church. It's the most spectacular. But Hartford's a pretty nice place.
Yeah.
Long tables run the length of the hall. Perpendicular to those long tables where the students sit is the high table where the faculty sits. If the students are eating roast beef, the faculty are eating prime rib. If the students are eating steak, the faculty are eating filet mignon. Everybody comes dressed in their academic gowns. The meal begins with a Latin prayer. You have famous paintings of benefactors and graduates at Hartford, William Tyndale, the Bible translator, John Donne, the poet there. They're looking down on you, I think, to make sure you're using the right knife, fork, and spoon.
Yeah.
Chaplain introduces me as having spoken at the evensong service, and the woman sitting across from me who taught history there said, so Jerry, real loud, why are you a Christian? I thought she was asking because she wanted to know. Somebody else told me they thought she asked because she wanted to make me the entertainment of that night's dinner. My doctorate's in philosophy of religion. I could have probably entered in on some sort of discussion that would have been more academic and more in the apologetic vein, but that's not why I became a Christian. And I said to her, I became a Christian because I was aware of shortcoming in my life. I was aware of incongruity. I was aware, I believed in the high ideal of love, like I mentioned just a moment ago, but I was aware there were times I had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world, and I saw the hypocrisy. And when I heard that the God of the universe loved me unconditionally and forgave me for all of that, I found the message compelling, and that's why I became a Christian. She is taken back by that answer because I think she was expecting some sort of engagement that would have given us both indigestion after the meal was over. And she said, well, I can appreciate that, but that's just not my issue. And I said, really? I think I understand what you're saying. You see, I didn't become perfect overnight after I responded to the gospel. That took 2 or 3 weeks before that happened. And the whole faculty busted up in laughter because they know that that statement's nonsense. Nobody's got it together. And I looked at her and I said, your laughter just betrayed you. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you and I just met, so you couldn't know the specifics in my life that made that statement nonsense. But either your read of history or your read of your own heart has shown you nobody has it together. She was taken back by that, and she said, you got me. I said, I'm not interested in getting anybody. But I am curious, if you know the incongruities in your own life, what gets you by? What are you turning to? What are you leaning on? She said, well, I have faith in humanity. So this is a woman who just told me she didn't have needs, and now she tells me she's a devotee of the faith in humanity. And I said, well, let me ask you some questions because I want anything that's going to help me. Have you ever been wounded by another human being before? She said, of course. I said, have you ever wounded another human being before? She said, I suppose so. She was a little softer on herself. And I said, how does this faith in humanity work where we've been wounded by others and we've done our fair share of wounding of others? And just then the man who taught French there, sitting next to her, said, how does it work for Christians? We spent the rest of that meal talking about faith in Christ as a vitality, as something that was relevant to life, as something that was needful. And it was just, you begin with the reality of honest assessment of your own self and find yourself questing for what is it that can solve the human problem.
Well, it sounds like it did turn into some sort of apologetics at the dinner.
It wasn't apologetics at that point. As a matter of fact, I think we really started talking about how significant interpersonally the grace of God was as it operates in our life.
Yeah.
If I know that I'm loved by God and I know that his love isn't conditional, I can look honestly then at my own shortcomings. If I'm in a relationship with somebody and there's difficulty, I can look honestly at that. I may not always look honestly at it, but I can begin to move in that direction.
The last few weeks we've been going through Acts at my young adults group at the church, and Paul appeals a lot based on his experience with Christ. Even though he has apologetics and he does the thing on Mars Hill and he does in the synagogues, he makes arguments from the Old Testament. But he does tie it back to him being the one who persecuted Christians, and then he talks about how God confronted him.
Yeah. God loved him.
Yeah.
In spite of what he did.
He did. He also told him how much it would cost him to live this life right away. And I like that too, because I think counting the cost is sometimes something we leave out of the gospel message to make people more ready to accept it. But, you know, Jesus and Paul definitely wanted to emphasize like, hey, there's a cost to this. Obviously, what is the cost compared to what you're getting? But they did tell people it's not going to be a comfortable life on earth.
It'll be more joyful.
That's for sure.
Than living unconscious of the things you do and leaving in your wake people that you've hurt.
Yeah.
If you know that God loves you, you can look honestly at your life. And that means then when you screw up, you don't have to beat yourself up. You could say, well, I screwed up. Lord, once again, I see the relevance of the gospel this day. Forgive me of that sin. Maybe you go back and ask forgiveness of the person you might have hurt. And then you say, how can I grow and do better next time? I pray prayers of confession each day. So 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and righteous to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. He's faithful and righteous because Jesus already said it's finished. He's already paid the price. But I'm not living in that redemptive love and grace. So the Greek word for confession is homologeo. So a seminarian takes a class in homiletics, and it's on preaching. But the word literally means to say the same thing. So the preacher wants to say the same thing the scriptures say. The person praying the prayer of confession is saying the same thing about themselves that God already knows about them, but they're coming into self-awareness about. So they pray that prayer. they can look honestly at that, and they can receive grace once again and go deeper in their understanding of what it meant that Jesus died for us and forgave us. It's always relevant, constantly relevant, if we're going to live honest lives.
Yeah. That's the rock of everything. That's the foundation of everything we do from then on. Because otherwise, we're going to slip into trying to be a good Christian.
Yeah. Well, it's easy to slip into pretense, think that we've got it together or something like that. C.S. Lewis said that the worst of bad men are religious bad men. The quicker I'm willing to die for my faith, maybe the quicker I'd be willing to kill for my faith or paint a "Thus saith the Lord" across my own beliefs. So you're not arguing with me now, you're arguing with God. And there's a loss of hermeneutical suspicion about our own position. I think you can have a sure word about some item, a sure word about truth, and therefore you could speak it with confidence, but you'll never have a last word. We could say you can have a last word as far as a court of appeal. You could appeal to Scripture as your last word, your final court of appeal. But we never have a last word about any truth we know, because any truth we know can still be plumbed more deeply. It could be applied more widely, even to questions we haven't asked yet. And it could be seen in some sort of coherent relationship with other truths that we've learned. So consequently, there's always depth. Our understanding of God and of life itself should be dynamic, not static or inert. Once it becomes static or inert, we can begin to think we've got it all figured out, and we become delusional.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of the danger of creating a theological framework is you can start building a prism or a paradigm through which to view Scripture, and then next time you view Scripture, you're viewing it through this paradigm instead of coming to the biblical text freshly to maybe see something different that you hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
I don't want to solidify everything I think about it. If I'm going to grow in maturity, I have to be able to change what my belief is.
Well, you got to change is an interesting word because it could be used several ways. You can have a change of kind where you throw out the old paradigm because you've embraced a new one.
Right.
Or you can have a change of degree, like a tree that adds more rings into its present structure.
Right.
And so the change of degree is something that's always necessary. And change of kind may be if I'm thinking wrongly about something. But I think you can get onto a core truth and then develop it like the tree adding its rings.
Right.
So Walter Elwell, the theologian, said, all theology is approximation, and we seek better and better approximations. God is really big, and we're pea brains. And I said that to a friend of mine once, and he said, no, Jerry, the Pacific Ocean is big. God is enormous. And I think this is true, but that doesn't mean I can't know some things. A child coming to faith as a 5-year-old has locked onto something that they're not going to have to change about as far as change of kind is concerned. But if they're going to develop and grow, they're going to have changes of degree that constantly come. And Lewis is big on this. His biggest idea, there's 73 books that Lewis did. 56 he wrote before he died, and the others he wrote after he died. No, they were collections that were put together from unpublished materials that were brought together under common cover by a guy named Walter Hooper. But of those 73 books, the biggest idea he writes about, it appears in all of them, is this: reality is iconoclastic. Reality is iconoclastic. And it goes along with the line of what we're talking about. I have an image, say, of God. And that image is really helpful. I heard a sermon, I listened to your podcast, I read a book, I had a late night conversation with friends, and some of the pieces of the puzzle came together for me. And I have a more robust understanding of God than I ever had before, and it takes my breath away. But if I hold on too tightly to that present understanding, it competes against my having a more developed and growing understanding. And Lewis says God, in his mercy, always kicks out walls of any temples we build for him because he wants to give us more of himself. So the iconoclast is a person who breaks idols. And the image that might have once been helpful, if I hold on to it too tightly, it becomes an idol. Right. Reality is iconoclastic. And so there's the point of faith and theology and all these things. They must be dynamic. They must be dynamic. So I don't have a problem with somebody having a theological construct that they come from. Maybe they're a Calvinist or something like that. And that's helpful to them at the core, but it's not the last word. There's more.
Right. So I want to know how you got into C.S. Lewis to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Well, after I became a Christian, I wanted everybody to know that God loved them and forgave them. And so I started sharing Christ with the guys I played football with in college. And they started asking me questions, and I had no clue. You know, if God's good and all-powerful, why does evil exist in the universe? How do we know the Bible is really God's word? How do we know Jesus is really God? You know, and what about other religions and so on? All the good questions, the apologetic questions. I had no clue what the answers were. And I'd say to my friends, those are good questions. I don't know. I'll try and find out. And I'd go dig and look for answers. Anytime somebody asks you a hard question, it doesn't close the conversation. It invites you to show them that you respect them. And I'd go back to them. I'd say, remember the other day when you asked me these questions? You matter to me. And this is what I found as I did some digging. And then you reopen the conversation. Sometimes they would trust Christ. Sometimes they'd ask another question. So anyway, when I would go dig for answers, there was a name that kept creeping up into the literature, C.S. Lewis. And I love the quotes I read about him in that literature, but I never really read him. So my junior year of college, my college roommate and I went up to San Francisco, the Bay Area. We took our bikes with us and went up riding all around. And we stayed with my sister. She's married and a little bit older than me, and she was teaching fifth grade. And one night over dinner, she told me the plot of the story she was reading to her fifth grade class called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I go, come on, there's stories like that? I was amazed. So I hadn't been a big reader. I think I read 6 books before I went to college, not counting comic books, you know. So the next day we were riding around in San Francisco and we came to the Cannery, and there was a bookstore there, and they had box sets of the Narnian books piled up in the store. And so I bought a box set for her kids, and I bought a box set for me, and I read them over the next few weeks. And I loved them. And I wanted to find out more about him, and I heard he wrote a limited autobiography of how he moved from atheism to Christianity. When he gets to his conversion, the biography stops because he made his point. It was basically testimonial apologetics. I read that story in Surprised by Joy. And he talks about these deep longings and his quest to find the object of his longings. And I knew the longings. He gave me a vocabulary for my own soul in that book. So I started reading him voraciously. We had a professor, my college was pretty secular. It started by Christians, but it was far removed from its moorings. I only knew of 3 Christian profs at the college, but one of them was a philosophy prof who was one of the most respected profs on campus. And I saw he was requiring some C.S. Lewis. I took every course he offered. I was a PE major, but I had enough units in philosophy for a minor, but nevertheless, he helped me also. And he also was the first one who ever spoke to me and said, I think you've got a mind. I think you could think. Nobody ever told me that before. I got my first D in 3rd grade, and nobody got upset. They were surprised I did that well, you know. Yeah. So anyway, I graduate from college, and by that time I'm reading Lewis voraciously. And a guy wisely said to me, you don't get an education in college. You lay a foundation for an education. And the graduation exercises we call commencement. And he says, it's time for you to commence your education by building on that foundation. Pick an author who will take you places and make him your life study. I think he could have said, pick a composer, pick an artist, pick a period in history, pick a literary figure. So anyway, I picked Lewis. I go to seminary and I have to write a thesis. And there's no way I was going to write it on the use of the optative mood in the Greek text of Philemon. It wasn't going to hold me. And I asked if I could write on Lewis, and they said yes. And that was the first time I put pen to paper on Lewis. And so then I started reading him, started teaching him, started writing articles about him. And now I've lectured on him in 81 universities in 19 different countries. I've got 9 books, but 7 of them are about C.S. Lewis. And if nobody was interested, I'd still be all in. But I travel overseas about, 5 to 8 times a year giving lectures on C.S. Lewis. Little would I have known.
I'm surprised at how influential he is. Like, I'll see his quotes pop up in all these different places. I was reading a book called Technopoly by Neil Postman. He quotes C.S. Lewis in the book. He quotes about C.S. Lewis saying that bureaucracies are of hell. I was listening to a podcast recently with a guest, Dr. Peter Kraft from Boston College.
I know him.
Yeah, and he's a frequent guest on this podcast called Pints with Aquinas. And
Pints with Aquinas?
Pints with Aquinas, yeah.
There's one called Pints with Jack. It's on C.S. Lewis too.
Oh, okay.
And I've lectured at least twice at conferences where Kraft was one of the lecturers.
Oh, very cool. Yeah,
he's brilliant.
He seems brilliant, and he's a joy to listen to. Mm-hmm. He's just seems like a really awesome guy.
Yeah.
But I listened to a lecture where he was giving his top 10 books, and then he's like, yeah, but then I realized that it was more like 13 because I wanted to do one of every category. But then I realized I should do 2 of every category, so it's 26. He's like, but then you're going to ask me what's the third book you would add. So he did 39. 39 books from 13 categories. But C.S. Lewis was 6 of those books for him. And Chesterton was 4 of those books. But he's another one who just loves Lewis. And at a certain point, I was like, wow, people got to expand their horizons because everyone, in Christianity is always quoting him. And I'm like, there's got to be someone else. And I'm like, he really was like so singular that he's inspired. So it's like when you hear a musician say they were inspired by the Beatles, you're like, come on, there's got to be someone else. But like he was so monumental.
The singularity is in faith integration. It's not singularity as far as breadth. His pen is like the narrow end of a funnel, and his reading is like the wide end of that funnel. He wrote one book called English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. To write that book, he read every book written in English in the 16th century. Talk about honest scholarship. So when he made a judgment, it would be informed. He read every book translated into English in the original language it was written, Old French, Italian, Latin, whatever it might have been, and in translation. So when he made a judgment on the translation, it would be informed. That's just one of those 73 books. It's a massive work and a prodigious work of scholarship. But if you read Lewis, you'll find he opens more than wardrobe doors. The singularity is the integration of faith and learning. But the multiplicity of sources that he draws on. I started reading Lewis. He was my liberal arts education. I read Lewis, he took me to Homer. I read Lewis, he took me to Virgil. I read Lewis, he took me to Plato and Aristotle. I read Lewis, he took me to some of the early church fathers. He took me to St. Athanasius. He took me to Augustine. He took me to Thomas Aquinas. Took me to Boethius. My word, I'd never heard of Boethius till I encountered him in C.S. Lewis. A lot of people have trouble with foreknowledge and free will. Boethius, in Book 5 of his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, answers the problem of foreknowledge and free will with such simplicity. You say, how did I ever struggle with this? And Boethius, so Lewis said it was the most influential book on medieval literature after the Bible. And Lewis said a person wasn't considered educated if they didn't know that book up to 150 years ago. And it was interesting because Albert the Great translated it. Chaucer did a translation of it. Queen Elizabeth I did a translation of it. So influential is this book. I'd never heard of it. I'd go read it and I'd count it, in my own life, I'd count it one of the 10 best books I ever read. But then you start moving on and you get to Chaucer, and you get to Milton, and you get to Shakespeare, you get to Philip Sidney, you get to Edmund Spenser. I'm probably the only former PE major who's actually read The Faerie Queen. And if my old football buddies had seen me reading Philip Sidney's In Praise of Poesy, they would have thought I lost my mind. And then you end up reading the more contemporary ones. You read Jane Austen, you read George MacDonald, my heavens. And Tolkien and Lewis, of course, they were good friends and read their books to each other. And he opens more than wardrobe doors. Reading him is a liberal arts education. The singularity is in faith integration, but it's not in singularity of resource or singularity of topics even. He writes about everything. You can't believe the number of things that he writes about and topics that his searching mind is saying, okay, here's a problem. Is there anything in faith that would help me resolve this problem? Is there anything in the wide range of literature that's come before me that would help me resolve this problem? And it's very helpful. And I can give you several examples of that. But anyway, that's what I think you find that's so intriguing about him.
The other thing I found very intriguing about him is the ability to write amazing nonfiction and fiction.
Yeah.
And that seems like people only do apologetics or write novels. He did both very well. And how is that the case, that no one else seems to do that, except maybe Chesterton wrote both fiction and nonfiction?
Well, Lewis was uniquely gifted. You'll find some people once in a while who begin to approximate the regions where Lewis traveled. I think Frederick Buechner might be an example. He writes some perceptive theology. He wasn't a theologian per se, but he was seminary trained. He had a theological background. But I mean, he writes theologically oriented material. He writes literary material where he's thinking through an idea and expressing it with great literary aplomb. He writes fiction as well and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize even for his fiction, the book Godric and so on. So I think you have some people that approximate that, but nobody like Lewis. Depending on how you count it, he wrote between 11 and 17 literary genres. So he's writing poetry, both lyric and narrative poetry. He's writing Christian apologetics. We already talked about that. He's writing literary criticism. He's writing novels. He's writing satire, Great Divorce and Screwtape Letters. He's writing novels. He's got Till We Have Faces. He's writing perceptive soul exploration work like A Grief Observed or Letters to Malcolm Chiefly on Prayer. He's writing something like a Bible commentary. He writes reflections on the Psalms. I mean, it's just amazing breadth. And I think he writes what interests him. And he brings to the table a pretty searching mind. And consequently, we benefit by it. And that means there's multiple numbers of entry points for Lewis. If you're interested in this, you'll find a place there. He writes fantasy, children's books, we didn't mention that, science fiction as well. So if you're interested in this, you find an entry point in Lewis. And then if you read well, it will take you to other places too, and your own liberal arts understanding of life will be benefited.
Yeah. And for believers, he's a great starting point, like you said, because he's going to introduce you to so many other things.
Yeah.
Were you always well, I know the answer to that. You were not always a big reader, but is it more natural for you to read now and enjoyable, or do you still have to kind of bring yourself to it?
I read voraciously.
So you just, you flipped a switch at a certain point and you just love it.
Yeah, but I read deliberately too. You know, I mark my books. It's like Mortimer Adler in How to Read a Book. He says, have a conversation with the writer. My books are filled with marginalia, where I'm discussing with the writer. If I disagree, I say why. If I agree, I say, can I take this further? And I write notes in my margins and stuff like that. So I read deliberately. I probably don't read as much as some people because I read slowly and deliberately, but I read a lot and I'm old, so I've read tons. You know, and one book opens a door. Like there's an author I got to through C.S. Lewis. Her name was Evelyn Underhill. And she wrote to Lewis. She was a philosopher of religion. She was the first woman given university-wide lecture status at Oxford University. And she was older than Lewis. She was a contemporary of Chesterton's. And Lewis wrote Out of the Silent Planet, and she read it and liked it. So she wrote a letter to him. And it was one of only maybe his first 5, 6 books, you know. It was the first of his science fiction books. And she wrote him, and he wrote her back and said, receiving a letter from you was the greatest literary experience of my life. So you read that from Lewis and you say, wow, who is this woman? And then after he wrote The Problem of Pain, she wrote him again and said, you make faith readable. You make theology readable. I like this book, but I didn't like your chapter on animals. I think your vision of God is too tame. It lacks a little wildness. And some people think that maybe Aslan is good, but he's not tame, came from Lewis receiving that letter. And she said, I don't know if you remember me or not. And he wrote her back and he said, no, that last letter I received from you was the greatest literary experience. He says it twice. So I go read Underhill. And she has this one book called Mystics of the Church. Again, she was a philosopher of religion. She was giving radio talks on the BBC long before Lewis was and so on. So I read this one book, Mystics of the Church, where she talks about the fact that there were always people who had a mystical inclination to want to follow after God, and they were hungry for him, and it was heartfelt and questing. And she said, you have Old Testament mystics in this book. You have New Testament mystics. You have early church history mystics. Then you have early medieval mystics. And then in the later Middle Ages, she identifies in various chapters French mystics, Italian mystics, Latin, Spanish mystics. And she goes through the broad list of mystics. And she gives a chapter where she usually looks at 2 or 3 of the most significant mystics of that place and time. And then at the end of the book, she gives a bibliography. So if you get interested in one of the mystics she talks about, you could go read those mystics. Well, I spent 2 years reading through all that stuff. I read it slow, I read it deliberately, and I benefited. It took my breath away. And so I think there are things, you read. I still was reading Lewis, and I never stopped reading my Bible. I'm in my 65th read through the whole Bible. I've read the New Testament 42 times besides that, and I've read my Greek Bible twice, and I'm in my 3rd read through my Greek Bible. I'm no great Greek scholar. I keep a lexicon but near my elbow because there's a thing in Greek called the hapax legomenoi. Those are words that are only used once in the whole Greek Testament. I don't care how well you know your Greek, you're still going to have to look up the occasional word.
Yeah.
But still, plugging through and seeing that stuff, it's beneficial to me. I read the Bible all the time, but I read all these other books. And I've had people say to me, I don't need other books. I've got my Bible. And I go, unless you're a farmer and you only have time for only one book, you've chosen the right book. But if you say, I don't need other books because I've got my Bible, you're not reading the same Bible I'm reading, because my Bible doesn't shut me down. It opens me up to a wider world where I could discover God everywhere. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, she said, every bush is a burning bush and the world is crowded with God. And Lewis says in Letters to Malcolm, God walks everywhere incognito. Our responsibility is to awaken to him and even more to remain awake to him. So there you go.
I think I'm actually slowly going through Chesterton's biography by Ian something.
Yeah.
And
Ian Boyd.
I feel like it's Ian Kerr or something like that.
Yeah, I know the biography that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I have it over here on my bookshelf.
A lot of it is like also excerpts from his autobiography in there, but that quote that you just said by Browning is in there.
Yeah.
I've already gotten through that part.
Yeah.
Because
there's a book, Chesterton 101. If a person wants a great introduction to Chesterton, they should go to that book. And then it refers to his other books. And if you find something that you particularly like, you could go look at the book and see it in whole. But it's a very good book, I think.
So just on a kind of a practical level, I like reading, but I feel like I typically, this is just maybe my personality. Normally I start 5 books at once and then I kind of forget that I was reading 3 of the other ones, and then I might finish one and then whatever. I'm guessing that's not how you read. So how do you...
Well, feel comfortable in your own skin. That might
Right.
be the way that you're kind of wired and so on. My thing is when you're not having to read because somebody's cracking the whip and you're taking a course and you got a grade over your head, the profs are giving you books to read that they think are important for you to know.
Right.
When you study that subject. I remember I took this one class in grad school, and it was a 2-credit class, contemporary theology. There were all the required books for the class with 5,000 pages of collateral reading. And at the end of the course, 2-credit class, I got B's and A's on all the papers and tests, but I only got 10% of the reading done. I was working, I was married, and so on. 10% of the reading. I failed the class because I had to fill out an honor question.
Right.
What percentage of reading? I said 10%. I failed. Next year, I went back and had to take the class again. And I got A's on all the papers and tests because I'd already done those. And it's the same reading. So I read another 40% of the reading over that year. So I put down 50% and I got a C in the class. But I thought this professor was one of the most respected professors I had. It was Dr. Sosi, Robert Sosi at Talbot Graduate School of Theology. I really respected him. And I felt like he gave me that reading to read because he thought I should know it. So out of respect for him and out of interest in the material, I continued to read it. One book was called Philosophy and the Christian Faith by Colin Brown. So I read what Colin Brown said, then about a philosopher, then I went and read that philosopher, then I came back and read what Colin Brown said again to see if I agreed with him. Then I went to the next philosopher, read what he said about that one, went and read the philosopher, and so on. I started taking notes. If I ever taught philosophy, how would I go about this? That chance, a former PE major is going to teach philosophy, but through a series of circumstances. I was teaching C.S. Lewis at a community college near here, College of DuPage, and there was somebody who was supposed to teach philosophy that year, and 36 hours before course started, he took off and went to a different school. And the dean said to me, Jerry, could you teach a philosophy class? And I said, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I said, yes, but how am I going to do it within 36 hours? Because I had the whole philosophy class outlined from the reading I continued to do from that soci class. And I benefited from the material, and I went in there not utterly intimidated. And then, interestingly enough, years later, Talbot Graduate School of Theology asked me to come give the soci lectures at Talbot. And I go to give them, and I say, I know I'm the only person to give these lectures who actually had Dr. Soci as a professor, and I'm confident I'll be the only person who gives these lectures who could actually say he failed the Soci class while he was in seminary. Again, we don't get intimidated by these things. You lean into them, and you grow through them and develop. And so there you go. You just keep going and growing, and it's all fun.
Actually, as you were talking, I just remembered Lewis said something about that. He said, it seems like students are afraid to approach the sources, and they'll rather read
secondary
material, which isn't as good, and it's actually more technical.
Yeah.
So he's like, just go to the original.
It's worse than that. I talk to students, and I'll say, well, have you ever read Dante? And they'll say, well, yeah, when I was in college, I read him. As if their education inoculated them against learning.
Right.
I read it back then. And Lewis says if a book's worth reading, it's worth reading more than once.
Definitely, yeah.
But you can go, they have Lewis's library here at Wheaton College. And you could go look at it, and you could pull out Don Juan by Lord Byron on the last page. He has the date when he finished it, and right underneath it, he wrote, never again. And Lewis refers to that too in Surprised by Joy, that very book, but you can see it. It's here. And
why was that?
Huh?
Why was that?
Well, he didn't think it was a book worth reading more than once.
Okay.
So some books aren't.
Right.
But there are some books that become lifelong companions, and you read them over and over again. I've read Dante bunches of times. Plato I read over and over. I like Plato. I like Milton. I like Chaucer. I love Chaucer.
Yeah.
And so you go on and you read these different authors, and I mentioned Buechner, and I mentioned Evelyn Underhill and all this stuff. And there are certain ones you camp out at, and you read them over and over because they benefit you so much. And every time you go, you bring more to the reading because you've grown a little bit. So you get more out of it each time.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay. But my rule about reading, because we were talking about that, somebody's not cracking the whip now. And so now you're free to commence your education by building on the foundation you've laid. My rule is if you pick up a book and you start reading it and you don't like it, don't read it. Don't torture yourself. Put it aside, but don't prejudice yourself towards that book. It might be the very book you need five years from now. But read the books you like and enjoy, and make reading a habit that is so refreshing and so enjoyable. And then move on to the next book. Or maybe that book opens doors where you go read these other books and you explore a whole given area of research and so on.
Yeah.
With Lewis, he fought in World War I. I've been to all the places where he fought in World War I. But I got interested in World War I as a result of that. So I read sometimes books on World War I. It's fascinating to me. I've actually been to the Latin Bridge where Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. And this stupid 19-year-old did a stupid thing that led to the deaths of millions of 19-year-olds because of it. I've been to the bridge where that happened. It's fascinating. So you end up reading about something, you get interested in it, and then all of a sudden it takes you to other places and you read more. It caused me to look at my own history. My grandfather fought in World War I. So I wanted to find out about what was his experience. I tried to find out as much as I could. These things and that's the other thing too, how we think. So some people say, well, in the West, we think in a linear way. one thing leads to another, and there's a sequential approach to it. In the East, they say they think in a cyclical way. You know, guy Harold Best, he used to be the dean of Conservatory of Music here at Wheaton College. He says, well, what if it's a helix where it's winding up? And so it's got characteristics of linear and characteristics of cyclical. And does it wind up and get tighter and tighter? Does it go further up and further in? Or does it get wider as it goes up?
Yeah.
And then you had a guy named Deleuze, who was a literary philosopher in France, and he said, "No, what if we got it all wrong? What if it's rhizomie, and it's like roots? Roots go down in the ground, and they go. You follow this tributary, then you come up here and follow this one over here, and come back over here and follow this one." I like that model. It's more organic than the others, but the thing is, it's still a model. It's not the thing itself. It's how we think about the thing.
Yeah.
And it's helpful. And we keep getting new models. You know, our little systems, again, have their day, and they have their day and cease to be. They're broken lights of thee, and thou, Lord, art more than they.
I heard in an interview years ago, John Piper and Tim Keller talking about Lewis because they both really loved reading Lewis. And I think it was Piper who was saying that it was either one of his professors or a mentor or somebody, but like who really helped discipline his thinking to like his reasoning skills. And that's what helped his apologetics later on. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think I might. I'm not sure. There was a philosophy professor at Wheaton when Piper was there named Arthur Holmes. He's since passed away, but he was an eminent philosopher and very good. He might have been the one, but also Piper got interested in Lewis when he was at Wheaton, and the guy who started the Wade Center, the largest collection of Lewis material in the world, was Clyde Kilby. And Kilby was also a guy who could have been the inspiration behind what Piper was talking about. I don't know for sure. But Piper, he's a great Lewis fan.
Yeah.
And so is Tim Keller. And Tim Keller's wife, when she was a little girl, wrote these letters to Lewis, and he wrote her back, and those letters have been published in Letters to Children. She was only about 9 years old, I think.
Yeah, I read, so after Keller passed, his biography came out, and I read that in there. And yeah, it was crazy. They were at such an interesting time because, I mean, Tim and Kathy, because they were married by R.C. Sproul. They met Francis Schaeffer. She wrote letters to Lewis. And then he was really influenced by John Stott. But like that era that they were around, they like rubbed shoulders with like a lot of interesting people at that time.
Yeah, I've had probably privileges of meeting all those folks too. And
You met Schaeffer?
Yeah, just once briefly. When he came here to Wheaton, it was his last trip to Wheaton. He and his wife were both here.
When was
I
that?
met them. It must have been 1988, something like that, maybe 89. Something like that.
Was he living in Switzerland at the time?
No, he still had his home, Waymo, where Labrie started, but he was up at Rochester because he was going up there for cancer treatment, and so on. And I went to his conference. You know, How Should
We Then Live?
Yeah, I went to that and listened to all his lectures live.
What do you think of Dr. Peter Kraef's comment that he thinks C.S. Lewis was a Catholic but didn't know it?
I think it's balderdash.
Yeah.
And the reason why is you can read Lewis's letters. He wrote a letter about 6 months before he died, certainly in the last year before he died, talking to somebody why he was not a Catholic. And he made it pretty clear. Lewis, though, is a mere Christian. And that's why Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants find him so helpful. Because when he sticks to the centrality of the Christian faith, he's saying something we could all agree on. When he did the Mere Christianity lectures, he had the lectures read by an Orthodox priest, a Catholic priest, an Anglican priest, and a Methodist pastor to make sure he wasn't saying anything that any of them would find inappropriate. He stuck with Mere Christianity, and that was his benefit. By the way, Churchill, when he became prime minister in his second term, he extended to Lewis an opportunity to be knighted. And Lewis refused the knighthood. Could you imagine Sir Clive? He refused the knighthood because he didn't want anybody to think that his Christian work was in any way connected with some sort of political movement. And it's fabulous that he was that principled and so on.
Mm.
But anyway, yeah.
Even if we just take Lewis's apologetics, I feel like they're very creative in the way that he presents them. And I would say there doesn't seem to be any close seconds after him, at least that I can think of, especially in the last few decades. Why do you think that is?
Well, first off, Lewis he was a good logician. He was good with his mind. And he sought to clarify things clearly. He defined what he was talking about clearly and avoided equivocation. He stuck with the definition and built inferentially in a sound way, arguing from thesis to conclusion in ways that show incredible precision in his thinking. But he also not only sought to explain something, he sought to depict it. And so he would write sometimes the same thing he wrote about propositionally, he would write about fictionally. So, for example, The Abolition of Man, he thought it was one of his best books. Mortimer Adler, the philosopher who was the last editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Britannica, was the editor of the great books of the Western world. He included that in the great books, which means he put it up there with Plato and Aristotle and Shakespeare and so on. And The Abolition of Man, Lewis writes about, and he writes about it by depicting it in that hideous strength. And it is so present. What he's writing about in those two books are things that we see going on in our culture right now. If you want to know how to answer the confusion of our culture, go read Lewis, who's writing about these things 60, 70 years before these things are occurring. He could see where things were going. He was almost prophetic in his voice. But again, propositional and then fictional. And you've got Surprised by Joy as his autobiography up to his coming to faith. And he depicts it in an allegory. The only allegory he writes is Pilgrim's Regress. And it's there as well. And he does this frequently where he is writing about something. And then you read Mere Christianity. He'll make a propositional statement and then he'll give you a little illustration of it. You know, he depicts it. So he understands you can appeal to the mind and it may just stay there. You want to appeal to the emotion and the heart, you've got to depict it. And then you can make your judgments for the will, because a person would be willing to go in that direction, not feeling having been coerced and not feeling like the mind runs ahead of the heart. He said the first problem in life is how do you fit the stone in the shell? And the image is from Wordsworth's The Prelude, where William Wordsworth wrote this poem. And in this poem, there's a Bedouin shepherd who's walking with a stone in a shell. The stone represented reason. The shell represented the romantic longings of the heart. How do you fit the stone in the shell? How do you bring reason and romance together so you appeal to the whole man? And when he wrote The Pilgrim's Regress, it was, by the way, his first apologetic work, and it was a work of fiction. He titled it The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romance. He thought Christianity could bring this in a holistic way together. And that's what Lewis is trying to do. That's why he writes propositionally and depicts imaginatively.
Mm. That's the secret, right? Is those two things
I
together.
think we can learn from him.
Yeah.
I think we can learn from him. I think preachers would do well to learn from him. You know, they preach a sermon, they say something propositionally, but give the person an illustration. I've heard preachers say, you don't want to use illustrations. They're too emotional and so on. And I go, well, what do you think Jesus was doing with the parables? My heavens. He gave the parables for those who have eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear. And he gave the story. What is Nathan? Nathan's told, you got to go tell David he screwed up. David's already killed somebody to cover up his sin. And Nathan's got to go tell him the story. So what does he do? He gives a story. David hears the story. And he says, that man has to pay fourfold. David loses 4 sons, by the way. He has to pay fourfold. He heard the story where he couldn't have heard probably the proposition. You've screwed up. And I think people sometimes can get, Lewis says reason stands, corrupted reason. You know, if I sin, I either have to change, or if I'm going to continue down that path, I'm going to have to come up with some rationalization that allows me to continue without having to deal with my sin. Aristotle coined a word for it called akrasia or akrasia. It means to be without moral command of my life. I've rationalized my bad behavior to the place where I don't even think clearly anymore. And Lewis says, reason stands like dragon sentries in front of my heart. How do you get past the dragon sentries to speak to the person who no longer has eyes and cannot see, and ears and cannot hear? And Lewis says, sometimes story gets past the watchful dragons. And Lewis engages in the stories that way.
Mm. Do you think he learned that creative way of apologetics at all from Chesterton?
I think he learned some. He also learned a lot from the great storyteller George MacDonald.
Yes.
And George MacDonald was he said he never wrote a book where he didn't quote from him, if not a direct quote, at least borrowed an idea from him. Tolkien liked him too, and they talked about mythopoeia. Mythos means story in Greek, and poieo means to make. So it's story making, but it's story making and myth making that seems to break out of the materialistic age and break into the transcendence by telling a story and opening us up to something that's beyond the mere limited materialistic worldview. Lewis even writes about it in some of his essays on writing for children, that we need to engage in escape, that there's a great spell that's at place in our world. And we think this materialistic world is all it is. And we need spells to break the spell of materialism. And consequently, Lewis says, this literature helps us escape.
How do Christians now, in a world filled with distraction and short-form content, learn the art of story making once again?
Well, first off, we have to pray. Pray for people who are writing these things that they'll get a hearing. If we want to be that kind of a writer, we need to read. We need to read the people who did it well and elegantly. And we need to try to imitate at some level. Obviously, you can imitate, but you don't want to copy. You want to imitate by mediating it through your own unique personality and time and place and so on. But I think those are the things that can be done. The thing is, though, that the way our materialistic world is working and the way our sort of podcast world, I mean, you're doing podcasts, but the way that social media is working and stuff, it's almost like those who are on top of the pile get to determine what gets heard and what doesn't get heard. And they're sorting out and sometimes even blocking. Not everybody's doing that, but some are. And some people could say, oh, I got blocked by the media, but they might have got blocked because they weren't writing good stuff. You know, we can use that as an excuse too. But I think in this world where there's limits, we have to recognize we might not be heard.
Right.
And does that bother you? And instead we should say, that's okay. If a handful of people hear me and it's worth saying, then praise the Lord for that handful of people. And then maybe that next time there's 2 handfuls of people, next time 10 handfuls. It says in Scripture, when a man does his work well, he'll stand before kings. And so sometimes you just faithfully work, and maybe you find that one day it flourishes. But if it doesn't flourish, your faithful work maybe reached 10s and 20s, and that's okay, because it was worth reaching those 10s or 20s. It might be that you're doing faithful work and you reach tens of thousands, or more, but it's okay. You feel a call to it, you do it, and you serve God in that area because you're faithful.
What was Lewis's mindset in approaching writing? Was he trying to reach as many people as possible? Did he not really think about that and just tried to write something and get it published? What was his mindset going into that?
Well, it's hard to tell what a person's mind was. Every once in a while somebody says to me, if Lewis was alive today, what would he say about this? And I said, who could ever answer that question? And if you try, you end up using Lewis like a ventriloquist uses his dummy, and you mediate your own ideas through what you say Lewis would say. I don't know. I don't know what his mindset was. I think early on, there's some indications that he had a hope that he would be a great writer, a great poet. I know he wanted to be a great poet, but he didn't get the audience for his poetry that he had hoped he would get. But I think later on, he laid that aside. And I think after he became a Christian, he was less interested, and he wrote with compulsion. He felt like he had something to say, and he wanted to say it, and he said it well. And because he wrote with discipline and because he continued to write, his writing became more and more refined and better as time went on. His ability to address different topics also increased as the breadth of his grasp and the breadth of his curiosity increased, and thinking clearly through these things. So I think that he gained the wide audience, but he even, before he died, he thought that all of his books would be out of print 3 years after he died. And he said that to a guy named Walter Hooper. And Walter Hooper was like Samuel Johnson's James Boswell, who basically, did the life of Johnson and wrote all the stuff about Johnson after Johnson died. Hooper was Lewis's Boswell. And books would go out of print by Lewis, and Hooper would find a bunch of stuff that hadn't been popularly made available. They were in journals and stuff like that. He'd put them together under common cover, and he'd go to a publisher and says, "Would you like to print this?" They knew Lewis had sold. So they said, "Yeah." And he says, "Good. You can print this. I'll give it to you to publish, but you have to bring out 2 books that have gone out of print." And they did. And virtually everything Lewis wrote's in print right now. But it was because of Walter Hooper feeling a call too. Just as Lewis felt a call to write, Hooper felt a call to maintain Lewis's reputation and make these books available. So, you have different callings, and sometimes those callings will put you before a broad audience. Sometimes they'll put you before 1 or 2 people. Be faithful to the call.
How long did he meet with the Inklings? What was the time frame of that?
They started meeting, I think, in the late 20s, and it was actually not the Inklings. It was a student who had had tutorials with Tolkien and tutorials with Lewis. They knew each other very casually, Lewis and Tolkien. They taught in the English faculty at Oxford University, but the student had tutorials with them and knew that they were both interested in Norse mythology. So he asked if they could meet and start a little club where they would translate the Icelandic sagas to each other. And so Lewis said that they would all struggle to translate a line or two, and Tolkien would go on for pages. He said Tolkien was a man who lived inside of language. He would learn a language a year just to learn it. As a matter of fact, he signed the contract to do the translation of the book of Job, Jonah, and some of the Psalms for the Jerusalem Bible, the Catholic translation. He signed the contract before he'd even learned Hebrew. My Hebrew professor in grad school said he thought it was the best translation of Job in the English language. So anyway, they started meeting in this group. They called themselves the Coal Biters. And then the students graduated, and now it's just Lewis and Tolkien left in the room. So this is the late 20s. And then, as a result of that, Tolkien said to Lewis, I've been working on something. I'd like to show it to you. And he brings out his manuscript of what he had done so far on Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and stuff. Lewis read it and loved it, and so they started meeting, reading their things to each other. As a result of that time, there were a couple of others who joined them, and of course Tolkien was in place then, and also Hugo Dyson, and they were the ones who shared Christ with Lewis. At the time, Lewis was already on the threshold of being interested in converting, and Lewis had said, he reasoned his way through atheism and materialism as a supporting worldview, reasoned his way through the morass of agnosticism and what religion would be the right one. Came to the place where he's a theist. That's when he says, in the Trinity term, 1929, I was the most dejected convert in all of England. Who can duly respect that person who's brought kicking and screaming and darting his eyes in every direction looking for a way to escape? But he bowed to the constraint of truth. He believed this was true, and so he accepted it. But it was theism at that point, not Christianity. And he said he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. That's the analogy he champions. And then he has this late night talk with Tolkien and Dyson. And Tolkien says, you like myth wherever you encounter it. How come you don't like it in this great story where it actually comes down into our world in the incarnation? Lewis would later write an essay called Myth Became Fact, when Christ came down. And so he realizes his analogy of Hamlet and Shakespeare was a good one. How could Hamlet ever break out of the play to get to know the author? But in fact, Shakespeare could have written himself into the play and made an encounter with character Hamlet possible. And he says, I think that's what happened in the incarnation. So that whole time was right at the very beginning of the Inklings. And then they start meeting and they start reading their material to each other. And if you want to know a great, great book on it, read The Company They Keep by Diana Glyer or Bandersnatch by Diana Glyer. She's the greatest Inkling scholar in the world.
Mm.
Yeah.
So why didn't Lewis follow Tolkien into Catholicism?
He didn't believe it. He didn't buy it.
Even
I
at
think,
that point when he's still like new to it, he didn't buy it?
well, here's the deal. Lewis is writing Mere Christianity. I think the feature that Lewis felt most difficult for him to get over when it came to Catholicism is that it was the only church. Lewis didn't buy that. But he had great respect for Catholics, and half the Inklings were Catholics, and he had great fellowship with them. He knew they were real believers. You know, I think you can find some Catholics who aren't real believers, just like you can find some Protestants who aren't real believers. What makes you a real believer is, what have you done with Jesus? What are you to make of Christ? And so on. But the Inklings were Christians. And so Lewis, I don't think, was willing to accept that Catholicism was the church. You know, he was accepting Jesus was the only way to God, but he wasn't accepting that Catholicism was the only way to Jesus.
Did he and Tolkien have any, back and forth about this?
I think they did, but their friendship was deeper than any conflict that would divide them. There's actually rumors out there. There's a lot of rumors about Lewis. You got to, search them and stuff. There are some people that think that Lewis and Tolkien had a falling out at the end of their life. And as a matter of fact, Humphrey Carpenter in his book, The Inklings, writes about that. Well, I once had dinner with John Tolkien, Tolkien's oldest son, and I once had a beer with him at the Eagle and Child. And we were talking about some of these things. And I said, what was this about your father and Lewis having a falling out at the end of their life? He said, I read that in Carpenter too. I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, in fact, the last year of Lewis's life, I would drive my father to Lewis's house so that they could have a couple hours conversation every week. He said there was no falling out between them. What happens is maybe you're a close friend with somebody, or you have a family member you love, but in writing a letter to another family member, they did something that kind of, miffed you or something. So you write a note in your next letter to your family member saying, John did this thing, it was goofy. Biographers a lot of times glam onto stuff like that.
Right.
And they'll take a little incident and they'll make a mountain out of a molehill.
Right.
And I think that's what some biographers have tried to do with these things. And Lewis did some things that aggravated Tolkien. And when he got married, he never told Tolkien about it. They were best of friends. That's pretty bad, I think. Lewis screwed up.
Yeah.
So what do you say?
Why would he do that?
I'm not exactly sure. I know some of the Inklings got upset because Lewis is a bachelor, and he's always expecting these married guys to show up at different things. And they'd show up, and their wives were always put on the back burner. Now he gets married, and he wants his wife to be in the middle of everything. And maybe there was some hesitancy because he realized he hadn't been quite as fair with them as he should have been. I don't know the answer to the question. But, or maybe he just didn't think it was necessary. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. But whatever the reason was, it wasn't his best moment.
Right. I know Lewis looked up to Tolkien's fantasy writing. What did Tolkien think of Lewis's writing, whether it be fiction, nonfiction?
Well, Tolkien liked his writing. He didn't like Narnia. He thought it was a hodgepodge, and all this stuff. And the irony is, when he had that late night talk with Lewis, just a couple weeks before Lewis converts, he says to him, you like these myths where the gods come down into the realms of man. And how come you don't like it where it really happened in the incarnation in Christ? And that got Lewis thinking of that Hamlet Shakespeare image and so on. So Lewis came to the place where he believed, in a sense, that pagan literature was to the pagan what the Old Testament was to the Jew, tutors to lead them to Christ. Because here were all these mythologies that had something in them that at least echoed some sentiment similar to what we found in the gospel. And so Lewis is basically writing consistent with what Tolkien had said to him. He's got Greek myths and Roman myths. He's got Nordic myths. He's got Irish myths. He's even got Santa Claus and Bacchus and all this stuff thrown together. And Tolkien thought it was such a hodgepodge. But Lewis thought, no, this is a story where all the myths are pointing to the coming of Aslan, the coming of the incarnate one. So I think they misunderstood each other. Tolkien was such a purist too, and he was so meticulous, and he wanted everything right and every T crossed and every I dotted just right.
He's a perfectionist in a way.
He was, and Lewis could just jot stuff off. You know, he's pretty quick. A lot of stuff he wrote, and he had very little revisions to it. My experience in writing is that you do the research, that's about a third. You do the writing, that's about a third, but the revisions are going to be at least a third of your work, maybe more. Maybe it's 40% or 50% of the output and hard work of putting out a book.
You know,
Lewis seemed to get by with very little revision.
Interesting. So I'm trying to think, because Tolkien's books were really long and detailed, and he created languages for them. So it's a different type of work than what Lewis was doing, but Lewis was very prolific in a sense.
Well, they were writing, though, fiction and writing fantasy, and their vision for fantasy is very similar. You can read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, and you read Lewis's essays on 3 ways of writing for children, or you read Lewis's essays on sometimes story says best what needs to be said. And you see that there's a common vision that they have. And I think it grew out of a lot of mutual conversation and so on. So I think they had a fair-minded understanding of some of these things, even though they differed on, you know, what about these other mythologies? Can they still speak and point us to Christ?
Yeah.
So in some senses, Lewis is picking up on what Tolkien told him that night, and he is being true to what Tolkien said to him. Tolkien probably forgot because, again, he's this purist.
Right. So Tolkien's not a fan of allegory per se.
Neither of them were really.
Yeah.
Lewis wrote one allegory, that's all, and it was The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. But Lewis, he was a medievalist, so he liked the love allegory. One of his first literary critical works was The Allegory of Love, and it established his literary critical reputation as a medieval historian. So he liked reading them in that sense and so on, but I don't think either of them enjoyed writing them per se.
Speaking of enjoying writing, I've always heard that he didn't enjoy writing screw tape letters. Why was that?
Well, I think that it was perceptive in its analysis. He's looking at his own sin, trying to write about this. He wrote in the second edition a preface, and he said, "Some have paid me the undeserved compliment of supposing my letters are the ripe fruit of many years' study in moral and ascetic theology. They forget that there's an equally reliable, though far less creditable, way of writing about wickedness. My heart I needeth no others, teacheth me the way of the ungodly." And I think he wearied of it. I mean, you can be so introspective and you look at how screwed up you are. We've all got plenty of material to work with there. And I think you could eventually say, I think I need a mouthwash. I think I need to move on to something else.
And he wasn't that like a weekly thing?
Yeah,
he was writing?
They were published in The Guardian. He was paid £2 for each letter. £2 then, it would be a little bit more than by today's standards. It would have been probably about $20 per letter.
Really?
Yeah. And then when they were all done, he published them in a book, and they went out of print within about 2 or 3 weeks. I think in the first year they were written, it went through, I don't know how many printings. It was massive numbers of printings and at least 2 editions.
What book had the most printings before he passed away?
Of his books?
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you. Mere Christianity, huge. Screw Tape Letters, huge. He was on the cover of Time magazine after Screw Tape Letters came out. You also have the Narnian books, went through many publications.
I feel like in Screw Tape Letters, he talks a lot about the war, so I'd assume it's pre-1945.
He's writing it during the war.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And where was he during the war? In Oxford?
He was in Oxford.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, he got up to Cambridge. I showed you that picture when you came down here to the pub, where he's talking to these RAF chaplains. He'd go minister to RAF airmen. They were dying in droves. And
Royal Air Force?
Yeah, and he was trying to share Christ with them. He wanted them not to die without knowing Jesus. And as a consequence, he was doing all this ministry, but that picture that was taken was while he was still teaching in Oxford, and it's taken right below the very room he would have when he would go to Cambridge as a professor at Wheaton College, Cambridge. So he was up at Cambridge quite a bit. And a lot of the air bases were all situated around Cambridge. Not only the RAF bases, but also the American air bases were all there. There's a huge cemetery there, almost as big as the cemetery in Normandy, where the D-Day invasion took place. There's a huge American cemetery just outside of Cambridge University that the university gave to America to bury their war dead, mostly from airfare stuff. So let's say a bomber's going over on a bombing raid and a Messerschmitt comes and strafes it with bullets and somebody in the plane gets killed. They would bury them there at Cambridge University in this cemetery called Mattingly. And there's a memorial there to Joseph Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy's older brother, who went down. They never recovered his body. Glenn Miller, the band leader, he was flying back, and they don't know what exactly happened. The plane went down. Some people speculate maybe there was a plane going on a bombing mission, and it had engine trouble and had to turn back, but you can't land with bombs. So it jettisoned the bombs over the English Channel. Some people think Glenn Miller's plane was flying underneath it right when the bombs were dropped. Wow. They don't know for sure, but there's a memorial there to him at Mattingly.
I didn't know Glenn Miller passed away during that.
Yeah. He was going and entertaining the troops.
Did Lewis travel a lot, or did he kind of stay around Oxford?
He was on a vacation once with his mother to France before she died. And he was in France during World War I. And other than that, all of his transportation was going back and forth to Ireland. So he still was Irish. And he would say, I'm an Irishman,
Yeah.
But at the end of his life, after Joy recovered and so on, before she died, she said, I want to go to Greece. I want to see Greece. And he took her on a vacation to Greece. And it was one of the few times he traveled outside of England. He traveled on plane twice. Once when he went to Ireland as he took Joy there after she had recovered from her cancer. And then once when he went to Greece, he flew to Athens. Yeah, his gardener was a guy named Paxford. And Paxford was the guy that Lewis modeled Puddleglum after in The Silver Chair, where he's as good as gold, but he's got the negative, he's kind of like Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
And you know how Puddleglum would say, well, we could go on a picnic, but it'll probably rain. If it doesn't rain, we'll probably find that our food is spoiled when we open up the picnic basket. Or if it's not spoiled, we'll probably find there's ants all over the place. And I like to put the best face on things I possibly can, So Paxford, as Lewis is getting ready to go to Athens with his wife, before the taxi can pull away, Paxford comes out and says, Mr. Jack, did you hear? There was a plane that crashed and all the people on board, they were burnt beyond recognition. Did you hear me? Burnt beyond recognition. And that's the last thing he hears as he goes to Heathrow to take the plane to Greece. He didn't travel that much.
Was it just because he was busy and enjoying what he was doing? Or
he was an inventor at Walker. And he did these walking tours all the time. But he would go in England and he enjoyed seeing things outside of Oxford and so on. But there's a lot of beauty in Great Britain.
Yeah, definitely. I've only been there once, but I did get to stop at Eagle and Child.
Yeah.
That was 2017 that I was there.
It's closed now.
I know. I literally looked it up on Google Maps, and then it said permanently closed. I was like, ugh. Well, I'm glad I got to go there. So.
I think it'll open again.
I don't know why it wouldn't. It feels so significant.
Yeah, somebody bought it and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. I think that they're going to try and make a hotel or something out of it, but keep the Eagle and Child as the entry to the hotel and also keep it functioning as a pub. Yeah. And I'm hoping that's what'll happen.
Yeah, I went to some other pub in Oxford that they said was in operation since like the 1300s. I forget.
Well, you've got the Turf.
This one was like a stone one. Yeah, it felt outdoor. Yeah.
Outdoor. And the Turf, that's been around for ages. And then also the Bear is the other one.
Oh, that could
Those
be
are
it.
the two oldest pubs in
Okay.
Oxford.
Is there a favorite work of yours, of Lewis? Or maybe favorite now? I'm sure it's changed.
My favorite book is whichever one I'm reading at that moment. And I read through them over and over and over again.
What's the last one you read?
Well, I reread That Hideous Strength and Abolition of Man because it was relevant to some things I was giving a lecture on. And I also was concerned about what did Lewis say that's relevant for what's going on in our own day today. And I found it extremely prescient. So those were the most recent ones. But I've always got a Lewis book going. I'm also reading through all of his essays. There's a collection of massive, it's like 700 pages of all of his essays. And I've read them all in the books they were published in many times, but I'm reading through the whole of them because I'm going to give a lecture at Queen's University in Belfast. And I'm preparing for that lecture by rereading all of his essays.
When's that?
It'll be in November.
Yeah. And you said you go to Ireland a few times a year?
Yeah, two or three times a year. I've been there twice already this year, and I'll be there a third time coming up in November.
What's your favorite place to travel to?
In the world?
That you've been?
Well, it's a tough question. I'd have to say the most beautiful city I've ever seen is Prague in Czech Republic. My favorite city in the world, though, is Oxford, and we used to live there. I like Oxford. If it comes to islands, and you want sort of tropical islands, French Polynesia, Moorea is my favorite. But if you want more of a wilderness kind of island, it's got seas and forests, it would be Orcas Island in the San Juans. And there's an archipelago of islands between Victoria, Canada, Vancouver, Canada, and Seattle, and that island. It's fabulous. If you want mountains, I mean, it's hard to beat the mountains of Alaska.
Yeah.
But when it comes, and I grew up in California, I love the high Sierras and stuff like that. But I think probably my favorite mountains would be the French Alps and the Swiss Alps. They're fabulous. If you want desert, maybe that region between Arizona and New Mexico, where you've got Monument Valley and things like that. It's fabulous. But I've probably been to England the most.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
When were you living in Oxford?
I had a sabbatical, and we went and lived there. And then I did my doctorate in the Oxford Center for Mission Studies, and I, for 10 years, commuted to Oxford. So I was there 3 times a year during that period.
That's why I was there, was because my sister was studying abroad for a semester, and so I picked her up, and then we drove to Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And we also stopped in York and went to Whitby.
Yeah.
And so it was beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had to pay a lot because I was under 25 to rent the car, but it was worth it.
Yeah.
So
that's good that you did that, and you'll go back.
Yeah.
It gets its hooks in you. My mother's family were Scottish, so I've been to Scotland many times.
I love it there. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Especially Edinburgh. It's just like the way that you walk up High Street and ends at the castle.
Yeah.
We didn't actually go in the castle, but we did, I think you can, right? You can go in it?
Well, you've got Holyrood is the castle at the end of the street, and you've got also St. Giles Cathedral where John Knox preached, but up on the hill is Edinburgh Castle. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that you would like to leave us with?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Before he died, C.S. Lewis got a letter from an American girl. Her name was Ruth. She was 11 years old. She had written him through his publisher, and the letter arrived at his house about 3 weeks before he died. And again, it's in the collected letters, C.S. Lewis's letters to children, which is where Kathy Keller's letters are published, the ones he wrote to her. So one of the last things he pens, 3 weeks before he dies, he writes back to this little girl in America. And he says to her, what I would like to leave with you: if you continue to love Jesus, nothing much will go wrong with you. And I pray you may always do so. And that's a good place to leave.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, bless you. It was fun.